Hello everyone, Feltropy here. Today I'm taking us back into the mess that is Warlock in Mythic Plus. In my last video I touched on some of the current problems and I got a lot of support for what I said, along with some valid criticism. With that said, in this video I want to shed some light on what I think is one of our biggest problems, the general Warlock class tree. A lot of our issues start there with a design that feels restrictive and just plain boring when it comes to Mythic Plus. However, to keep this video from being just pure bashing, I'll also offer some constructive feedback and suggest changes that could make Warlocks much more viable in M+, without making us overpowered in other content like raids or PvP. So let's take a look at the current class tree and break down what I think is problematic, what could use some tuning, and what flat out doesn't belong. The first and second rows of the tree are fine as they are. Row 3 doesn't need much either, aside from some positional tweaks. The only thing I would change is Howl of Terror. In its current form, it's borderline useless in PvE. Now, I get that Blizzard doesn't want a straight up copy of Psychic Scream, but what we have now just isn't good enough. If this version is going to stay, I'd move it into the PvP talent pool where it actually makes sense. Row 4 is probably the worst offender in the current tree. Demonic Embrace and Demonic Fortitude are basically the same talent with different wording split in two, and the same goes for Wrathful Minion and Demonic Inspiration. Amplify Curse, which was brought over from PvP, should go right back. The effects are too weak to justify its cost of a talent point and a global cooldown for relatively mediocre effects. Banish is very situational and needs some help to be useful. Row 5 isn't much better either. Teachings of the Satyr should follow Amplify Curse and get removed. Accrued Vitality is decent, but since Drain Life isn't that good, I'd move this somewhere else in the tree. Horrify could work with some adjustments, but I definitely move Nightmare to PvP as well. Lifeblood just feels like a talent filler with no real value. With all other modifier Healthstone has, this one just doesn't have a purpose and feels like a talent point soak. Row 6 is solid as is, however Row 7 could use some tweaking. Now, I'm not a huge fan of having DPS talents in the general tree for a pure DPS class, but it is what it is. That said, I'd remove 1 point from both Socratar's Guile and Sargerai Technique and tune them accordingly. These are essentially just stat tuning knobs and they are mandatory anyway, so forcing players to spend 2 points on them makes no sense. Shadow Flame needs to be deleted from the game. In its current form, it has no place in our tree or anywhere else for that matter. Row 8 also needs some adjustments. First of all, I'd move Swift Artifice higher up the tree. Demonic Tactics is a strong talent, but again, it's mandatory. I'd also move it higher to free up choice this deep into the tree. Teachings of the Black Harvest in its current form feels more suited for PvP. There's no real middle ground that fits PvE, so I'd remove it. Row 9 definitely needs some tuning as well. Resolute Barrier should be moved up the tree, cost 1 less point, and get toned down a bit in power to match its new position. As for Fel Synergy and Soul Link, they're tricky. You can't really adjust them without throwing the whole tree out of balance. And as much as I dislike them, I'd leave them as they are for now. Their underwhelming performance can be offset by better designed options elsewhere in the tree. Regarding Demonic Resilience, I honestly have no idea how this made it into the general tree. I'd keep the name, but give it a completely different effect and return the current version to PvP where it actually makes sense. The final row is frankly just bad. It offers very little choice and feels like a dead end. Soulburn is way too mandatory to be sitting this deep into the tree. It needs to be moved up with a bit of power reduction to compensate. Lastly, Soul Conduit should have been removed a long time ago. For Affliction, it adds RNG on top of RNG, which is already a design problem. Demonology doesn't benefit from it either, since it's already swimming in soul shards. And for destruction, the value just isn't there. A 5% proc chance is useless in single target, and for AoE it's irrelevant. Now, to make our general tree better, I've gone through several iterations of how it could look and what it should focus on. In my opinion, utility and crowd control needs to be emphasized more, while raw damage gains should be dialed back a bit. That doesn't mean I want Warlock's overall damage nerfed. Far from it. The point is, damage is much easier to tune than utility or defensiveness. You can adjust numbers quickly, but fixing poor utility or survivability requires actual design changes. So the tree should lean into what's harder to balance. As I mentioned earlier, the first and second rows would stay as they are. In row 3, I'd remove Howl of Terror, leaving Mortal Coil as the only option in that node. Demonic Circle would be moved to the slot currently occupied by our curses, and its original spot would be filled by the mandatory Demonic Tactics. Moving on to row 4, I'd replace Amplify Curse with our standard curses. Demonic Embrace would be removed and its effect merge into Demonic Fortitude, and in that freed up slot I'd place Abyss Walker. Soulburn would move into Abyss Walker's old position, but its cooldown would be increased from 6 to 10 seconds to balance its earlier availability in the tree. Demonic Fortitude would also go away and its effect would merge with Wrathful Minion. In its place, I'd move Horrify and rework it to affect both Fear and Mortal Coil. Row 5 would see a few significant changes. First, I'd replace Teachings of the Satyr with a new talent, Soulforged Curses. This would make both Curse of Tongues and Curse of Exhaustion eligible for Soulburn, allowing them to apply to all enemies within 10 yards of your primary target. I intentionally left out Curse of Weakness because applying an attack speed reduction to every enemy would be far too strong in Mythic Plus. It would quickly become a mandatory pick, and I want to avoid that level of power creep. Accrued Vitality gets moved to a section more focused on Drain Life, and in its slot I'd move Demonic Gateway. Sweet Souls would take the Gateway slot, and Swift Artifice would move up to replace Sweet Souls. Nightmare goes away, and in its place comes a new talent, Soul Conduction. This reduces Soulburn's cooldown by 5 seconds. Lifeblood gets removed completely and it's replaced with Everlasting Horror, a new effect which increases the CC component of Mortal Coil by 1 second. Banish also gets a modifier, which allows it to be used on non-player humanoids. Regular CC immunities that already exist on mobs would keep this from being overpowered, but it would give Warlock more value and even open up pull control options in M+, especially in humanoid-heavy dungeons. In the 7th row, both Guile and Teachings lose 1 point each, and Shadow Flame gets replaced with Umbral Blitz, a new talent which makes Shadow Fury an instant cast. Moving on to the 8th row, Resolute Barrier becomes a 1 point option, taking the place of Swift Artifice. And now brace yourself, Demonic Tactics spot gets filled by Spelllock. And before you start typing angry comments, hear me out. I get why Blizzard tied Spelllock to Fellhunter, but as I mentioned in my previous video, this limits Warlock's gameplay by locking us into a single pet. Putting Spelllock in our talent tree gives us freedom to choose other pets without losing that interrupt tool. Of course, with this change, Felguard's Extos interrupt would have to be removed as well. Alternatively, you could also have a choice that lets you keep Spelllock on the Fellhunter if you really like that style of gameplay. Staying in this row, Teachings of the Black Harvest gets replaced with a new talent called Talkiel's Lessons. With this talent, Demonic Circle becomes instant cast, we gain 10 seconds less of Demonic Gateway debuff, and we can place our summoning portal on our own without needing 2 group members to help us out. In the 9th row, Accrued Vitality would replace Resolute Barrier and Demonic Resilience would be completely redesigned. It would cause Fel Domination to reset its cooldown if your demon dies within 10 or 20 seconds of being summoned by it. This is a direct response to the frustrating M+ bugs that still plague pet survivability, especially with some trash mob abilities randomly killing our demons. For the last row, there are several new additions. Accrued Vitality would branch into Harvest Life, a returning ability that makes Drain Life hit up to 4 additional targets within 12 yards but with a 15-second cooldown. This would be a great way to handle pulsating AoE and rot damage during big pulls without being overpowered or mandatory. The other branch from Accrued Vitality would go into Hexproof. After dealing with curses for so long, Warlocks would have an innate resistance to most of them, shrugging off everything except the most powerful boss mechanics. There could be a clause to exclude player curses, but since there are very few of these, it likely wouldn't be necessary. Pact of Gluttony would take place of Soul Conduit, and Demonic Resilience would branch into 2 new talents. Eternal Resolve, which reduces damage taken by 3% while Unending Resolve is on cooldown, and one many Warlocks have been asking for ages, Demonic Familiar, a second pet. Now, this second pet wouldn't be overpowered or complicated. You could only summon Imp, Fellhunter or Syad. This pet's role is pure utility. It can only use its special ability, meaning Cauterize Magic, Devour Magic and Seduction, but it doesn't attack. To keep this talent balanced and not mandatory, you couldn't switch these pets mid-combat to spam the abilities, avoiding button bloat. You couldn't have 2 of the same types of pet active, and this pet wouldn't interact with pet-altering talents or those that draw power from your pet, or demons. And that's it, the full rundown of my proposed Warlock General Tree rework. Now I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think these changes are too tame, playing it safe without shaking things up enough, or maybe I went too far, turning Warlocks into an unbalanced powerhouse that overshadows other classes? I genuinely want to know what you think, so please leave your feedback in the comments. Oh, and one last thing to note, regardless of talent choices, all Warlocks would get Dark Intent back as a baseline spell, granting a party buff that gives 3% haste. This gets problematic if put into the talent tree, so I just make it baseline. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive. If you found it insightful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, take care and good luck in your M+ runs and the upcoming patch.